I like the idea of having programs created here in Vermont. I'm the ward clerk in Ward 3, and we have the Diebold voting machines, and I think people have heard about Diebold machines on the news. And I would like to see them programmed, voting machines programmed here in Vermont. I would feel much safer, and that my vote was much more secure if they were programmed here.
Yeah, I think, just to touch on that a little bit, I think that we should all feel comfortable with our voting mechanisms, and if there are people in town who don't feel like they are having a secure way to represent their, to vote, that's a problem. And I think that even if it's a few people, we still need to address it, because really voting is the fundament of our democracy, and I don't buy into voting as the only way that people can make a difference in their community. I think that every day we can make a difference in our community by talking to our neighbors, by being involved in groups, but I think that really we have to make sure that there's integrity in our voting system, and that's very important to me.
There's a housing shortage in Burlington, which I think you mentioned. Many people have advocated building more affordable or Section 8 housing. Where do you stand on this issue?
Yeah, I definitely support building and maintaining our affordable housing infrastructure. I think that there are really good people in the city right now who have some excellent ideas about how to do this. Some of it's through infill development, some of it is through supporting an overhaul of the certificate of occupancy process to remove red tape that discourages housing rehab and development. And I think that while I am not a person who would say that we don't need regulations, I also understand that it's hard to get through the regulations. And so when we make rules that are intended to keep housing safe and good for people, we also need to work with the developers to make sure that they can meet the standards in a way that's workable. So I think first you have to have safety, but you also have to have affordability, and I think those two can go together with really common sense initiatives, and putting some common sense in the process, not and also a little bit of hand-holding, or as much hand-holding as is necessary by the city with folks that are developing housing to make sure that things can be workable.
The Section 8 housing situation is particularly critical here. The large high-rise buildings in Burlington, seniors are given an apartment of 440 to 540 square feet, which is quite small. And they have to wait a whole year on the waiting list for those apartments. Yeah. And if they want to move, they have to wait another whole year. But if they want to get the vouchers, there's a 2-year wait. And the vouchers would allow them to get their own apartments privately. I would like to see something done about those waiting lists. Do you think the city could encourage more construction of Section 8 housing?
I think so. I think that there are ways that the city can do that. I know that the vouchers in terms of Section 8 do come from the federal government, and so we're limited in terms of the ways that we can sort of increase that. But I think that if we have more housing stock, then probably the vouchers would be more usable to people. And so I definitely support increasing the subsidized housing in the city, and will do whatever I can to make that happen. I think that we do have some really great minds at the Land Trust that are working on these things, and at CEDO. I'll do whatever I can to make that happen. My grandfather lives in a subsidized housing complex in rural Vermont, and I think it might be a little bit more square footage than that. He's really happy there. He has an apartment that he's been in for a number of years, and he has good neighbors. It's, you know, he doesn't have to worry about his expenses. He lives on Social Security, and so I think it's like probably the only way he could afford to really live on his own at this time in his life. So I think it's critical to people, and I think also for families. It's not just for elderly folks, but it's for families with kids. We've got to make a place that's safe and that puts a roof over people's heads, and that's a part of making sure our community is healthy.
You mentioned finding housing when your voucher comes up after the 2-year wait, but after you wait 2 years, they allow you 1 month to find an apartment. And if the apartments aren't available, then you have to go back on the list and wait another 2 years. And often many people aren't able to find an apartment, even though their vouchers has come up after the 2-year wait.
there's a real crunch in Burlington for space, and I think part of that could be alleviated by asking the institutions in our city, and I'm talking about Champlain and I'm talking about UVM, Champlain College, to house more of their students. If we ask them to take their third year of students, not just the first and second year as they do now, that would alleviate a lot of pressure on the market here in Burlington, which would both, I think, make things more available, which is critical as you're talking about, so that when you have that voucher and you need to find a place, you can find one. But also relieving the pressure would reduce the rents, I believe, and also it would give landlords an incentive to make their houses be habitable. I know a lot of people feel like the housing stock here in Burlington is really needing some improvement, and I think that's really true. And so if there's not this huge demand, then I think people will be more likely to keep their house, their property up to a certain standard. And so I think that asking the institutions to house some of their students is really a good place to start, and you know, there's obviously more that needs to be done too.
That leads me right into my next question. The housing shortage makes it possible for landlords to keep their buildings fully occupied while charging excessive rents and not performing needed maintenance. How about stricter code enforcement?
Yeah, I think code enforcement is really important. We need to have the positions at CEDO be fully developed and people in them, and I think we have just now hired the final person in code enforcement. And I think, again, that we don't need to have an oppositional relationship with landlords. I think we can have relationships that are about trying to make things work for everyone, and that's what I would hope we could continue to do or redo in at City Hall. But I do think code enforcement is important. It's the basis for keeping people safe in their apartments and houses.
Could something be done about the certificates of occupancy for these buildings that don't maintain themselves for the tenants?
I believe so. Yeah, I think we have to look at all of the mechanisms that are in place for dealing with people who should be keeping their houses up. I also know that there are a lot of small landlords here in town who really do try to do their best. So we're talking about a huge mix of people who own property here in Burlington, and I think we've got to come up with like common sense solutions that work for people so that they can continue to have the housing stock and also to keep it safe.
As you mentioned, in Burlington we have colleges and universities and other tax-exempt institutions. Sometimes they make payments to the city in lieu of taxes. Is this enough, or should these payments be increased?
Right. So Mayor Kiss has actually increased the fees for services that we get from Champlain College and UVM, and I believe a couple of other big institutions in the city. Sorry. And so those agreements have definitely added to the revenue here in Burlington, and so they're paying basically for their share of what the fire service would cost, or their share of what police services would cost, or a portion of that at least. It's a huge step, and it does make Burlington more financially viable, and so that's the kind of program I would support in working with Mayor Kiss.
Some of our viewers may not really understand the mechanism involved in payments in lieu of taxes. I believe constitutionally some nonprofit institutions are protected from taxes, so they would be, for instance, churches are tax-free. Mm-hmm. How does this work that they can be required to pay in lieu of taxes?
Yeah, I don't actually know all of the statutory pieces of it. I just know that there are institutions that pay in lieu of taxes, and this happens in Montpelier with all of the state-owned land that's there. So the state gives the city money instead of taxes, and usually it's about maintaining the infrastructure or the services that are required because that institution is in a city or a town. So I don't know all of the way the mechanisms work, but I think that where we can have those agreements, it's necessary to, and I think we should look at the full range in terms of who is in the city and who's not paying taxes, and I think even ask the question, why are certain institutions not paying taxes, and is that fair? I don't know a lot about that, but I think we have to ask those questions.
I'm sure the city attorney will fill you in on that.